This evening's special Night Owl session is on the Grand Canyon. Now, this is a bit of a different talk. This is not going to be a standard, here's my points and whatever. I want to take us on a virtual rafting tour down the Grand Canyon. I went rafting down the Grand Canyon in 1996, and what you're about to see is mostly the photographs that I took. It was on slide film at that time. This was in the days before digital cameras. But Grand Canyon is a wonderland for the photographer and for anyone who's gone there. How many people have gone to Grand Canyon? Okay, quite a number of you. This is that's great. You'll recognize some of these sites then. For the photographer, it's a wonderland of photography, just amazing things there. The canyon is over 277 miles long, and it's measured by river miles typically. It's about 18 miles across or 30 kilometers across at its widest point, more than a mile deep, nearly 2 kilometers deep at its deepest. And so it's a huge, huge hole in the ground. There's 4 million tourists a year that visit the canyons. It's a very, very popular tourist destination. In some places they have guardrails up like that, in other places they don't. You can just wander around. Here's one of the trails. There's a lot of hiking trails in the canyon. And once you get to the canyon and you stand at the rim there and you marvel at the canyon, the next question that comes to mind naturally is, what forces were involved in producing what I'm seeing here? How long did it take? Those are the kinds of questions that come to mind after trying to grasp the size of the canyon, which is very difficult to do. Because it's hard to tell that the thickness of the strata on the other side of the canyon there. How thick are those strata? There's nothing over there that enables us to have a sense of scale, like a school bus or a house or something that we're familiar with, so we can compare it to the strata on the other side. It's very difficult to get a feeling for scale. Not only the excavation of the canyon, but the deposition of the layers. How was the thing excavated? And then how were the layers that you see there laid down? And again, this is going to be, we started off with this in the first session here at the conference, talking about facts and interpretation. And the other speakers have followed on with that as well. There are the facts out there, and if we have that biblical understanding, the biblical history in our thinking, we'll interpret it in a particular way. If you don't have that biblical understanding or don't want to have that biblical understanding, accept that biblical history, then you'll interpret things in a different way. And so we're going to go through the canyon. We're going to see a bunch of facts. And what I want us to do is kind of look at the two interpretations that come from both the Bible's history and the millions of years history and see which interpretation makes more sense when we look at the rocks here. The history that you accept will determine how you interpret the facts regarding the formation of the canyon. Now, rafting, which is what I did, gets you up close and personal with the rocks. You're rafting right down beside the rocks, and I've done some other, like rafting. Whitewater rafting is considered a kind of an extreme sport. In fact, there's some of the biggest whitewater in the world on the Colorado River going through Grand Canyon. I've done some other things that are considered extreme sports. I've jumped out of a perfectly good airplane 8 times. I've done some hang gliding. I've had almost 300 flights on my hang glider. There's a picture of me flying there. Not too many mountains in Ontario where we come from, so we tow up. Here I'm towing up behind a specially designed ultralight. Flies very slowly and has a high climb rate. And, of course, it's Canada, so we fly in the wintertime, too. I used to race my cousin down the hill. He'd go on his toboggan, and I'd fly down. I'd always beat him. So, extreme sports. So that's sort of what we're doing here this evening, whitewater rafting through Grand Canyon. So, of course, we're going to talk about geology. So I suppose before we really get into this, let's look at some geologic terms, right? Here's some basic geology as we get going here. This first one, this is a fault. And the picture here shows a vertical fault. You can have other faults as well, lateral faults and compression and so on, but the break between the two sections of earth there is called a fault. And here's another one. This is a monocline. So again, it involves vertical movements, and this time you have an incline in one direction. It's a monocline. And here's one more. Now, this doesn't refer to the strata itself. It refers to the contact between two strata. It's right along here where this arrow is going. The strata on top do not conform to the strata on the bottom. It's an unconformity at that location. And as we go through the Grand Canyon, here's a cross-section of the rocks in the canyon there. You'll see all of those and many more things. This is from a book by Dr. Steve Austin, and I'll say more about that as we go on here. Geologists have named the different layers in much the same way that the books of the Bible have been broken up into chapter and verse so that we can reference it easily. And geologists do the same thing with strata all over the earth. John Wesley Powell was the first person to go down the river and examine the rocks and really map the area of Grand Canyon. Quite an interesting expedition. His first expedition was in 1869. He started exactly 100 years before my birth date. He started May 24th, 1869, with 10 men in 4 boats, and he ended on August 13th, 13 weeks later, with 6 men in 2 boats. He had a rough go of it. His second expedition, they took a photographer along on the second expedition in 1872. Here's a couple of the photographs that were taken at that time. There is Powell's boat, the second one in the background there. This is Marble Canyon before you get into the canyon proper, which is Grand Canyon. There's Powell's boat with a chair strapped to the top of it there. He lost an arm in the war. He was a war hero, and he had the men row, and he sat on that chair there and I suppose barked instructions. So geologists since the time of Powell have described the canyon, like he did, in terms of millions of years regarding its formation. It took millions of years to form the canyon. So we're going to investigate the canyon just like Powell did this evening. Well, sort of. Right? We have modern technology. So this is how my tour started. We've got these tour buses here, and this is in Phoenix, Arizona. Now this tour was put on by the Institute for Creation Research. There's their building formerly in San Diego there. And they did a fantastic job of putting on this tour. So the first question, as we start to look at Grand Canyon and get a feeling for the geology of the area, is why did the canyon form here? That's the first big question. Why did the canyon form here? If we look at a satellite photograph of the Grand Canyon area, let's just point out a few highlights here. Up here at the top, we have Lee's Ferry. There was a guy named Lee many years ago who had a ferry service. He'd ferry people across the river at that point. And I've got the river marked here in blue. That's the Grand Canyon there. And then there's some other features here. The first part of the river is properly called Marble Canyon, even though we kind of call the whole thing Grand Canyon, but that's okay. It's if you want to be technical, it's Marble Canyon down to the Little Colorado River, and at that point it properly becomes Grand Canyon. But the whole thing is we kind of call it Grand Canyon, and that's all right. Now we have an interesting geologic feature here called the East Kaibab monocline. You remember what a monocline was? Right? It's an incline in one direction. On one side of the monocline, it's 9,000 feet above sea level. This dark greenish area here, kind of in the center of the picture, that's forest. It's ponderosa pine is especially abundant in that area there. It's a raised area. On the other side of the monocline, it's 6,000 feet above sea level. 3,000 feet of relief between one side and the other side of that monocline. Now, if we look at the direction that the river is flowing, at this point, it's flowing in this southeasterly direction, quite happily along the monocline, as we'd expect. But then it turns and flows west. Why is the canyon positioned there? If the river, and this is the typical story, if the river cut the canyon, the river would have had to flow uphill for 3,000 feet to cut the canyon? How does that work? That doesn't make any sense. That's the standard explanation for the formation of the canyon, is that the river did it over millions of years. But if that's true, why would the canyon form there? And so that's an interesting thought as we get started there. Here's a photo by Steve Austin, taken from an airplane. You can see the relief there, the East Kaibab monocline. Looking northward, there's 3,000 feet of upwarping, and the canyon is positioned through that area. Why not along that area, if the river was responsible for that? Well, creationists have some ideas about how the canyon may have formed there, and I'll give you one of those ideas. And it goes something like this. There's the Kaibab upwarp. You can see that in the middle of the picture there. And there's this notion that there used to be a couple of lakes, huge lakes, to the north, Canyonlands Lake, to the south, Hopi Lake. And the total volume of water in these lakes was somewhere around 3,000 cubic miles. And as those lakes filled up after the flood, they overtopped the Kaibab upwarp. They were held back by the Kaibab upwarp, and then the thought is that Hopi Lake drained first, and that was followed then by Canyonlands Lake after that. Most of you have probably heard something like that. Now I need to add this on here. In the next issue of the Journal of Creation, that's Mike Ord just talked about that. In the next issue of the Journal of Creation, there is an article by a Dutch geologist who says that the canyon, and there's obviously data to support this, it's a landmark paper, the canyon was likely formed not post-flood, as I've just explained, but late in the flood, as a result of runoff, in the runoff of the floodwaters that at one point covered the continent. So we've got right at this point, when we have this conference here, by the way, for those of you watching the DVD, this is June 2010. So right at this point, we have another model, another possibility that fits with the Bible to explain the formation of Grand Canyon in that very odd location through that upwarped area. So I'd encourage you to consider, by the time you get this DVD, this will be a back issue, so you'll be able to purchase the back issue. For those of you who've signed up for it, I'm on the mailing list, obviously. I'm looking forward to this next issue because I've been down the canyon. I'm looking forward to this. Peer-reviewed articles from creation scientists all over the world, in this case, a Dutch geologist. Groundbreaking creationist research appears here first. Now, secular scientists who've studied the canyon have also come away with that idea, that the river did not carve the canyon, that some other forces were involved as far back as 1964. This is the cover of Science News here from 2000, but as far back as 1964, groups of geologists who couldn't find the deposits of the river. I mean, if the river carved the canyon, where should all the sediment be? Where should in the delta of the Colorado River, right? Where it goes into the Pacific. I mean, there's a lot of sediment there that's been carved out of Grand Canyon. It ought to be easy to find. You go to the delta of the Colorado River, it's not there. And this is a huge tip-off to geologists that the river did not carve the canyon, contrary to popular belief. And secular geologists understood this as far back, as I said, as 1964. It sounds like heresy sometimes, but even secular geologists are talking about some type of other force. Now, you might be thinking, okay, if it was either lakes that drained post-flood or late in the flood, water moved across this area, could water erode rock? Like, we're talking about water. Can water do that? This is a picture of the left spillway tunnel at Glen Canyon Dam. Glen Canyon Dam is upriver from the Grand Canyon. It holds back Lake Powell. This is the hydroelectric dam at the upriver end of Grand Canyon. The hole here, this is how the hole was caused here, this damage that you see here. Heavy snowfall in the winter of 1982 and then heavy melting in the spring of 83 was causing Lake Powell to get very, very full of water. And so they opened up everything they could in this dam to try to prevent the lake from actually overtopping the dam. And they opened up these spillway tunnels. They had all kinds of power generation going on and letting as much water through that dam as possible. And the story goes that the people working at the dam there, they felt almost like an earthquake. The whole dam was shaking, and then someone noticed that the water coming out of the left spillway tunnel was this brownish, reddish water. And so they shut down the spillway tunnel, and this is what they found when they went and had a look. This massive hole that you see here, that was water. That was produced by moving water. Moving at high speed, it has incredible power to do damage. That tunnel there was 3-foot thick steel reinforced concrete. Moving water ate through that. The hole that you see there took 63,000 cubic feet of concrete to fill. And that was done in just, not in years, but just in a very short period of time. Moving water has tremendous ability to do damage. So as we drive in our tour buses and get closer to the canyon, one thing you notice if you've ever driven to Grand Canyon, if you've been there, it's very flat. Drive up to the rim, it's very, very flat. But what's that on the horizon way back there? That's not flat. Let's get a bit closer. This is called Red Butte. Red Butte is about 1,000 feet tall. and it's Mesozoic strata, that's dinosaur rock, and that stands above the rim of the canyon. And there's a few layers of sedimentary rock and a lava flow, an ancient lava flow on the top of that, but 1,000 feet tall, and that stands, again, above the rim of the canyon. If we follow the strata here at the rim of the canyon, follow it further north, there's thousands of feet of additional strata. Causes us to ask the question, how much of that strata at one point existed over the Grand Canyon area? We have Red Butte, that preserves about 1,000 feet, and there's good evidence for another couple of thousand feet that used to exist above the Grand Canyon area. So now we're not just talking about the erosion of the canyon itself, it's the erosion of the canyon plus the erosion of thousands of additional feet over a huge area around the rim of the canyon. It's interesting as we look at the geology here and then try and picture how this is going to happen given that biblical history. Now, most of the information that you're going to get in this next couple hours or so is from this book here, Grand Canyon, Monument to Catastrophe by Dr. Steve Austin. There's a couple of copies back there at the back, but loaded with information. I highly recommend it. Some of the scientists that were with us on this tour, here's Dr. Andrew Snelling. And look at what he's got on his shirt there. He's got a cross-section of the canyon. He's using that as a teaching tool. And look at our classroom. There it is there. Some field trip, huh? There's some of our group, some of the other folks. Now, in this particular tour, there was the rafters. That was us. There was the hikers. They're gluttons for punishment. I don't know, hike down the canyon with all your food on your back. And anyway, there was a hiking group. And then there was a bus tour as well. You see some seniors there and so on. They were on the bus tour. And so the three of us kind of split up on the second day, and we explored the canyon from these three different positions. Here's another one of the scientists, Dr. Steve Austin. He's the author, the compiler of that book I just mentioned. And he's done a lot of original creationist research in the canyon. That's one of the arguments that skeptics throw at creationists. You guys don't do any original research. It's not true. All right, let's move on with our rafting tour. This is the day that we're going to get on the river. It's very early in the morning. We've all had breakfast. There's our tour bus you can see there at the hotel. And let's head toward Lee's Ferry. That's where we're going to start our rafting. And so here we're on the tour bus. I'm snapping pictures out of the window. These cliffs here, those cliffs way back on the horizon there, those are the Vermilion Cliffs. And the foreground silhouetted here, we have the Echo Cliffs. And we're heading upstream to the start of the rafting experience. Here's what the canyon looks like upstream. That's not generally where the tourists go, but it's just a slot canyon. It's just pretty much straight walls that go right down to the river, a few hundred feet. There's another picture of what the canyon looks like at that point. Let's get our bearings here and see where we're heading here. Let's look at this area, again using satellite imagery here. Again, there's Lee's Ferry up at the top. That's our destination. That's where our rafting tour is going to begin. And then we have on this side here the Echo Cliffs that you just saw silhouetted there. And in the background, there are the Vermilion Cliffs. And in between, you see Marble Canyon. At this point, it's Marble Canyon. So here's what it looks like from the bus perspective. You have the Echo Cliffs and the Vermilion Cliffs back there. And it would have been through this area that the water, which eroded the canyon, came gushing through, either late in the flood or post-flood. Now, as we drove along these cliffs here, these cliffs, this area is supposed to be eroded over millions of years. That's one of the interpretations. But as you drive along these cliffs, you notice at the bottom, very little talus. Talus is the rock fall, the rocks that have broken off of the cliff, and they've fallen down to the bottom here. It's called talus. Hardly any talus. Now, if those cliffs have been exposed for as long as evolutionists believe they've been exposed, there should be a lot more rock fall at the bottom, a lot more talus. Where's all the talus? A better interpretation is that those cliffs really aren't that old. And again, hardly any talus there at the bottom. Not enough talus for those cliffs to be millions of years old. Then here we are at Lee's Ferry. There's our rafts in the background there. The tour buses brought us right to our destination. And we're putting on these rain suits. Look at this, we kind of look pretty dorky there in our full rain gear. Why would we do that, right? Grand Canyon, it's in Arizona, it's very hot. But we were told to bring full rain gear. It's because the water in the river, at this point in the river, is at about 6 degrees Celsius. It's very, very cold. I'm not sure what that is in Fahrenheit. I'm Canadian. It's cold in Fahrenheit, right? Same thing. So, so when you go down the river and you get splashed by this water, it's very, very cold. And so that's the idea behind the rain suits. Even though it's in a Fahrenheit scale, it's hot, right? It's 32, 33, 34 degrees Celsius if you use a proper temperature scale. But anyway. So there we are with our dorky rain suits on and starting our trek down the river looking at the rocks. Well, here we have some instruction coming from Dr. Kurt Wise, who's a paleontologist down in Tennessee. And he's talking in this particular instance of this brownish to blackish, it's called desert varnish on the rocks. This desert varnish is, there's wind-blown particles, organic materials like pollen and so on that get plastered up against the rocks via wind. And when it decays, it produces this brownish to blackish, again, it's called desert varnish. And that builds up over time. It can get up to about an inch thick, or 2.54 centimeters if you're Canadian. But here's a recently exposed surface. There's the actual color of the rock, and then you have the desert varnish that gives it that darker brownish to blackish color. What's interesting is there's the same thickness of desert varnish from rocks at the top of the canyon and rocks at the bottom of the canyon. If the river carved that canyon, we would expect that the top of the canyon would have been exposed to the air a lot longer than the bottom of the canyon. But that interpretation just doesn't fit with the evidence. Again, you've got the same amount of desert varnish at the top and at the bottom. Now, we took frequent stops as we were going down the river. This is our first major stop. Here we are. We're still in our silly rain suits there. And here we're stopping here to look at these footprints. This is in the Esplanade sandstone. And they're kind of interesting footprints. I'll draw them in here. You kind of see them there like that. And you see the direction of travel is in this way, but the footprints, see the claw marks? The footprints are facing that way. The footprints are not going in the same direction as the animal is traveling. What could cause that? Dr. Leonard Bram at Loma Linda University in California made detailed measurements of 82 trackways in the Coconino sandstone. That's another type of sandstone. This is the Esplanade sandstone. But he made all kinds of measurements. And then he observed and measured hundreds of trackways of reptiles and amphibians in wet sand, in dry sand, underwater, on sloping sand, in a current, and so on. And when all of that experimentation, all of those experiments were completed, the most reasonable explanation for how these footprints were formed was not in a desert-like environment. That's one interpretation for sandstones out there. It wasn't deposited in a flood. No, it was a desert environment. Well, that doesn't fit too well with the Bible. But when all the data's in, the explanation for those is that that was an animal that was walking, perhaps on a slope or against a current, underwater. And then obviously something happened immediately after that to preserve the footprints. But you've got moving water, and so if the water is moving in this direction and the animal wants to go in that direction, it angles its feet like this to brace itself against the current. And that's when all the data comes in, when all the experimentation has been done, that's the most reasonable explanation. So again, we see more and more of a fit with that biblical history. Here we are stopping for lunch. We ate like kings on this trip. It was amazing. It's Mojave Desert environment down at the river level. Up at the rim, it's ponderosa pine. You get frost up there, even in March and April and May and that kind of thing. But down at the river, it's Mojave Desert. You don't have any dew at night. It's very dry. You get scorpions and rattlesnakes and that kind of thing. It's hot during the day, and yet we had fresh meat and barbecues and onions and mayonnaise and all kinds of things to make sandwiches with. Because remember I mentioned that the water temperature is very cold, just a little bit above freezing. They keep all of our food in the bottom of these rafts in big basins that sit in the water. It's a natural refrigerator. So even in a desert environment, you've got this refrigerator that doesn't need any electricity. And so we had all these fresh veggies and all kinds of things constantly as we were going down the river. The other groups, the bus tour, the bus folks and the hikers, they called us the float and bloat group because we ate so well. It was great. I loved it. But all right, let's get back on the river. Now we're coming up to an interesting sequence of rocks here. This is the red wall limestone that you see in front of you there. Now let's get a feeling for where we are in the strata here. The red wall limestone is right there, colored in red with the big arrow. Red wall limestone, about 400 to 500 feet thick there in the canyon. Now, I mentioned that it's difficult to get an idea of scale, how big things are in the canyon. The canyon always surprises. It's always bigger than you think it is. That cave that you see there ahead of the raft, you can see the raft. We had two rafts. There's the raft ahead of us, and you can see that it's heading toward that cave. How big do you think that cave is? Just think. We're getting closer. Here's another picture. There's the raft again sitting in front of it. Here's a picture from the back of the cave. It's enormous. It's incredible. Huge, huge cave. Red Wall Cave. We stopped here to have a look at some fossils from rocks that had fallen above red wall limestone, fallen down to this location. So there's Dr. Kurt Wise, and he's going to talk about these fossils here. He's got a little notepad there. And what we're seeing here, this is a crinoid, over here, crinoid stock, and these are bryozoan fragments here. These are marine creatures. They live on the bottom of the ocean, or they lived on the bottom of the ocean. Here's what a crinoid looks like. There's an artist reconstruction of it. That's an animal. It kind of looks like a palm tree, but that's an animal. Now, a study of modern crinoids reveals that the head, kind of the palm branches, if you want to think of it that way, upon death, it disintegrates very quickly. And yet there are complete crinoid heads, together with their stalks, found in Grand Canyon, fossilized in Grand Canyon. As well, we find areas where the discs that make up the trunk of the animal there, the discs come apart, and there have been areas in the canyon where the discs have all been fossilized together. What's the best explanation for that observation? Moving water. Moving water can both rapidly bury the heads, which rapidly disintegrate, and sort the discs. Moving water has a tremendous ability to sort things by size, by shape, and by buoyancy. And so moving water, again, that fits with the flood. I'm okay with that explanation. I'm happy with that. That makes sense to me. I mean, it's great to be a Christian. There's so much support for what we believe, and yet we're here in Grand Canyon. It's kind of it's the stomping ground of the evolutionist and the one who believes in millions of years. And as we go through the canyon, there's just abundant evidence. If you look at things properly, you interpret those facts, and you get evidence that the Bible's history is supported. It's all there in the canyon. A lot of fun. Here's the next morning. The sun's coming up above the canyon there and lighting up the top of the top few layers. We had devotions every morning and every evening. This is one of the best Christian camping experiences, Christian retreats I've ever had. I've been to many, many retreats, and I used to be handyman at our church camp when I was in my teens, and whole summers of boys' camps, girls' camps, youth camps, family camps, and so on, and many, many camping experiences. This ranks as right near the top. Just a fantastic experience. As the sun rises, it illuminates different parts of the canyon. And again, for photographers, this is kind of interesting. Here is fairly early in the morning, and here's a little bit later. The sun's almost directly above. Now it's illuminating the floor of the canyon, where here it was just kind of illuminating one side. So again, the character of the canyon changes as it's illuminated differently throughout the day. Now, if you look at this picture and you turn 90 degrees to your left, this is the view you get. There's this little side canyon. And this canyon is called Nautiloid Canyon. This is where we stopped the first night. And we were asked to help with some research, some creationist research that Dr. Austin has since published on. There are these nautiloids fossilized in Nautiloid Canyon. What are nautiloids? Okay, there's a fossil of a nautiloid. Here's an artist reconstruction. It's like a squid in a shell, in a torpedo-like shell. It has a point there, and it has little rings that mark different sizes of the shell. And it's kind of like a squid, and it's buried in limestone. This is the red wall limestone that we were introduced to a little while ago. And the conventional explanation for how the red wall limestone formed is It forms the same way that limestones form today. How do limestones form today? They form in the warm oceans like the Caribbean Ocean at a rate of 1 inch per 1,000 years. And geologists have said that that is a good analogy for how the red wall, 400 to 500 feet thick limestone formed. But there are other limestones that have preserved things amazing, with amazing detail. One of the most famous ones is Archaeopteryx, buried in limestone. Now, how could that have been preserved so beautifully if it wasn't buried quickly? Doesn't make sense, does it? It would have rotted. That had to be buried quickly, and that's buried in limestone. So what about going back to Nautiloid Canyon here? Is there evidence that it was not a slow raining down of particles that built up this limestone and then preserved these nautiloids as they slowly died and fell to the bottom? Well, Dr. Austin has noticed that the nautiloids, there's over 80 documented there at the Nautiloid Canyon, they don't point in random directions, as you would expect if it was a calm and tranquil ocean slowly building up this limestone. They seem to be orientated in one direction and perpendicular to that direction. What does that mean? It seems to indicate that there was a flow there, moving water. So when these organisms died, they either lined up with the flow or they were rolling along in it. So you have primarily two directions that these organisms have been fossilized. So then it wasn't a calm and tranquil ocean. Again, moving water was involved in the deposition of the red wall limestone. And that was, there was some original creationist research. There's a shot from the canyon looking out toward the river. You can see the river just in the very bottom of the silhouette there. It's a picture showing the reflection off of the little plastic film that we use, almost like transparency film. Here's a mother and daughter team drawing on what the nautiloid looks like, and these were all brought with us. Then it was time to get back on the river. Here we are on the river. This is day 2 on the river. What do you notice about our attire? No more rain suits. That's because if you get splashed with a little ice-cold water, it's hot in the canyon, and you warm up very quickly. And we thought, well, maybe we should look cool instead of... No, but it really wasn't that big a deal. And if you don't want to get a lot of water on you, you just sit toward the back of the raft. And some of the biggest whitewater in the world there, going down the river. But you don't have to get wet. If you're one of those people that likes to light their hair on fire and jump out of airplanes and that adrenaline rush, and you sit at the front of the raft. If you're more reserved and you don't want to get wet and you just want to watch everybody have fun, you sit at the back of the raft. It's like the rapids, even though they're big, it's kind of like driving a city bus over potholes in town. I mean, you can take a bicycle, and then you're really going to feel the holes. But this is like a city bus. You just kind of ride over the rapids. So we were having fun there. Again, there's the raft in the front for scale. Now, the layer that's coming into view below that vertical wall there is the Bright Angel Shale. That's coming into view at this point. As we go down the river, we're exploring these different strata layers here. There's the Bright Angel Shale. Limestone and sandstones typically form cliffs, and shale, which is more brittle and fragile, it forms slopes. And so you get that typical Grand Canyon profile. You can recognize that even without knowing if a photograph is about Grand Canyon. It has a particular profile, the canyon does. Here's our river guides. These guys are amazing. In order to pilot a raft and take a group down the river, you have to have gone down the river 100 times in order to be the main guy running the raft. Can you tell which one's the main guy and who's the trainee? But these guys are amazing. What an amazing job. They have to know how to read the river, to steer the boat through the safest part, to get all the people through. They need to know emergency first aid. I mean, there's no ambulances down there. There's 3 main modes of transportation in the canyon. There's rafting, there's hiking, and there's mule. You can take a mule train down if you want to. But if somebody breaks their back or breaks their leg or something, these guys have to know emergency first aid. They can fly a helicopter in there and in an emergency for sure. But they have to know how they cook all our food. And again, it's a very hot environment. They have to know about preparing food properly so that it doesn't spoil, and crowd control. What if you have some rowdies on your tour? I mean, you can't kick them out. You're stuck with them. So it's an amazing job. What an amazing job. Again, here's the Tapete Sandstone now coming into view. This is the lowest of the horizontal layers there in Grand Canyon. The Tapete Sandstone, you see it beginning to peek into view there underneath the Bright Angel Shale. The sandstone forms a cliff, and you can see it forming there. Now, at this point, we're down to the Little Colorado River. We've gone through Marble Canyon. We're now entering Grand Canyon proper. Now, the river water in Marble Canyon coming out of the dam, the reason it's so cold is because they take it through the dam very low in the lake. You can swim in Lake Powell on the surface, but a few hundred feet down or a couple hundred feet down where they take the water through the dam that goes through the turbines and then comes into the river, it's really cold down there. That's why the water is so cold. Forgot to mention that earlier. But the Little Colorado River has flowed along the surface and been heated by the Arizona sun. It's hot, and so we got out and went swimming at this point. And I'm the Canadian, so I had to, you kind of soap your hair and you splash some water on your hair. It's ice water, but everybody expects that the Canadians, well, you can just jump in and swim around. You won't get hypothermia. And they told us if you fall off the raft, we all need to work very hard to grab that person and pull them back in, because you can get severe hypothermia in just a matter of seconds. And so there was some danger there. But there were some Canadians, I was one of them, and they all expect that, well, you swim with polar bears and live in igloos. And so I had to demonstrate that. I did go in a few times and prove that I was Canadian. But at any rate, here's the Little Colorado River down at the bottom there. And at this point, we're properly entering Grand Canyon. It's Marble Canyon looking back up the river there. And so here we are here again, our satellite shot. There's Lee's Ferry. That's where we put in. And then we've gone down the river. We've examined all of Marble Canyon down to the Little Colorado River. And that's where we are at this point. Now, at this point, we see the great unconformity. There's Dr. Wise up in the right-hand side of your screen there. And I can just point out the great unconformity. Remember what an unconformity is? The layers on top do not conform with the layers on the bottom. There's the layers on the bottom are, in this case, tilted. And that's a great unconformity, and then the layers on top are horizontal. And that is right here in our little strata diagram here. The great unconformity is this red dotted line. And you can see the layers underneath have been tilted and then planed off, and the layers on top are horizontal. Here's a picture again from Dr. Steve Austin from his book, and you can see the great unconformity there. It's not too hard to see. Layers on the bottom are tilted, layers on top are flat. Now, both creationists and evolutionists agree that there's been time at this location, that there's been erosion at this location. Evolutionists typically believe that there's been an enormous period of time as the oceans have come up and they've slowly planed it off so that it was horizontal. The best biblical explanation is that was planed off at the onset of the flood. As waters came onto the earth, they planed it off very quickly. And again, you've got a fact there, and you've got the evolutionist interpretation. You have a very robust biblical interpretation. There's nothing wrong with that. Now we went hiking. Here we are getting ready for a hike. We hiked into what ended up being a very geologically interesting area. Here's this strata tipped up nearly vertical, about 60 degrees there or so. This tipped up strata at this location. And Dr. Steve Austin, at this point, I don't know about now, but this was back in 96, he was in great shape. It was amazing. When he led a hike, he just took off. And we'd ask him, well, how long is the hike? And he'd say, a couple of miles. And as the 5 days went on, we knew that, well, if he says a couple of miles, it's really 3 or 4. So, and he just gets up and goes. And some of us found it pretty exhausting. Here we are taking a lunch break. Here's some strata that's tipped nearly vertical. And here's a panoramic shot. Look at how tightly bent that is. Now again, there's a fact. What's a reasonable interpretation? A reasonable interpretation is that these rocks were not fully lithified. They hadn't completely solidified, lithified, before that upwarp took place. There was obviously some upwarp, and that pushed the layers vertical, and they were bent, not broken. If they had been lithified, they would have been broken instead of bent. Look how tightly those layers are bent. There's people down here for scale. There's someone's head down in the lower right of the picture there. So here's where we are right here. Here's our East Kaibab monocline, 9,000 feet on one side, 6,000 feet on the other side, and we are right here. We're exploring a side canyon right at that monocline where there's been that massive vertical adjustment. There's some very interesting geology at that point. And at this point, we had a little kind of a Bible study by Bernard Brandstater, who's actually here at this conference. And it was nice to meet up with him again. And then we went on from there. Now, this is another scale trick. This is on our hike back to the river, back to our rafts, after we went exploring in this side canyon here. Those green things down there on the floor of the canyon, well, how big are those? Are those little shrubs or are those trees? How big do you think those are? There's people down there. See the people? Those are people. The Grand Canyon is canyons within canyons. It's huge. It is a huge wonderland of geology. Here we are crawling down this slope here, and there's people down here you can see people standing down here who've already crawled down. They're just little specks down there. You can see their t-shirts and hats. All right, let's move on. Here we have the next morning. After we've done our hike, we've slept the evening, and this is our duffel line. So you can see folks loading their gear, their sleeping gear, onto the rafts. Each of us were given a tent, a little pup tent. We were given a cot to get us up off the sand. We were given a ground sheet, a little tarp, about 7 feet by 3 feet. Put your tent on that, or put your cot on that. Now, we had the option of using tents. Most of us didn't. We just slept out underneath the stars. It was beautiful. There's no dew. It's a Mojave Desert environment, right? There's no dew. Now, you need to watch when you get in your sleeping bag. You watch it for rattlesnakes and scorpions and that kind of thing, because they like to crawl in when it's warm. And in the morning, you check your shoes and knock out your shoes before you put them on and that type of thing. So we're warned about that. And then we went a little further on the rafts, and we're going for another hike. Now, this hike, this was an optional hike. I opted to go along, as did the people you see there in front of me. And there's Steve Austin up in the gray hat and the blue shirt up there. And he's marching on. We're falling further behind. Here he is. He's disappearing ahead of us. We're scrambling to keep up. And in this particular little side hike, this optional side hike, Dr. Austin and one of his helpers went to get some samples of a basalt, of a lava flow, a rock that was once molten for radioisotope dating. And here we are in an area where there was no trails. This is where very, very few humans have ever set foot. The canyon is so inaccessible. You've got the walls of the canyon, and it's very hard for humans to get down there unless you go down the river. Then you can kind of hike out and so on. But very few humans have ever been walking in this area of God's creation. So those samples were sent. They took some samples on previous rafting trips, and here's a sample that they took from the Cardenas basalt way down here. And they've also taken samples, the ICR scientists, from a lava flow from volcanoes near the rim of the canyon that spilled the lava down to the river level. Now, which of those samples should be older? The ones on the bottom, right? Exactly. The Cardenas basalt. And they sent the samples away to the same university labs that the evolutionists use. Here's the data. 1.07 billion years, 1.34 billion years. The rocks on the top are older. And again, there is a chapter in Dr. Austin's book, Grand Canyon Monument to Catastrophe, that goes into detail about these things. There's a whole chapter, a wonderful chapter on radioisotope dating using those samples that I just showed you there. And then it's time to get back on the river. There we are. We head down the river a little bit more and then take another side trip. And this, what you're seeing, well, that's my hat, first of all. And this is the Shinumu quartzite. And this is kind of a weird structure there, isn't it? Look at those strange contortions. Here's another area. This is nearly vertical. This is sort of like a wall that you're looking at. Not quite vertical. It tilts back a little bit. But there are these layers. You can kind of see banding there, light, dark, and then there's these bubbles. It's like a bubbling. One layer goes up into the layer above it, and even several layers up. Well, what are those? Geologists call those fluid evulsion structures. If you're a physicist, it's the Rayleigh-Taylor effect. What's the explanation for this? That was laid down. You have the banding, perhaps different currents laying down different sediment from slightly different areas, different colors. And then before all of the water between the grains has been squeezed out and it becomes a rock instead of mud, you have an earthquake. And that shakes that whole sequence, and the water within those grains bubbles up. It's trying to get out, it's trying to squeeze itself out to the surface, and you get these fluid emulsion structures, what the geologists talk about. Again, that doesn't sound like, 1 millimeter per year being deposited there. Obviously, that whole sequence, which is many feet thick, must have been laid down all at once, and then before it was lithified, you have an earthquake that shakes it, and you get this type of observation. Again, I'm good with that. As a Bible-believing, what's the new term? Not young earth creationists, biblical creationists. That's what we're going for, right? That's a good term. And then it's time to get back on the river. Cool off a little bit. There we are. That's coming right at me there with the camera, so that's fun. You ought to try that sometime. Now here we are rafting down the river and seeing more and more rocks all the time. And we're ready to make camp for the evening. And there's some people on the shore ahead of us there. Those are the hikers from our group. That's the hikers. They were happy to see us. You know why they were happy to see us? When you're hiking, what do you take with you? Freeze-dried bleh, just add water and stuff. They wanted our food, so they were happy to see us. But so we joined with, they stayed at our camp, and we stayed at their camp or whatever. And as the sun was going down, I went around with my camera and snapped some pictures. Not just rocks in the canyon. There's a bird. Look at that, life too. There's a lizard track. You can see the tail drag there and the feet marks in the sand. There's a millipede track, and there's ants down there as well. I thought these were cool. These red ants. And then I saw these huge black bees. They were totally black. They were like bumblebees, except way bigger. They're kind of like stealth bumblebees. And I've never seen anything like that before. So I took pictures of these, and then I ran away. Prickly pear cactus, especially abundant down there at the river level. Again, Mojave Desert environment. You'd expect cactus. The sun's going down. Again, it's a wonderland for photographers. There's the river. We're camped right beside the river. You have that water noise all night long that kind of soothes you to sleep. At this point, we were camped very near the Hakatai Shale. And here's the Hakatai Shale, this rust-colored rock. And let's just figure out where that is. You have the Hakatai Shale way down here. We've seen many of the different layers. As we go down the river, you get lower and lower in the strata there. And the Hakatai Shale is intensely penetrated with this lava as it's squeezed up through this area. You can see it's been displaced here. Here's this kind of 4 lines here, and they're down here. It's been displaced a little bit. So you have a dike and a sill as it runs along the layer up here. As it runs through the layer, it's called a dike, and as it runs along there, it's a sill. And we can think about how that may have figured in during the catastrophe of the flood, how that would have happened, or perhaps before the flood, during the 1,600 years before the flood. So we have those areas there. Now these guys, again, these river guides, they cooked all of our food here, these huge pots and propane burners that they cooked our food on. I think there's garlic bread in the front there, and there's a guy putting Parmesan cheese on his salad in behind, and we had, I think it was spaghetti. And there's some sausages there and spaghetti sauce. And again, we're the float and bloat group, right? Here's how we slept. Here's how most of us slept. Some of us set up tents. You can see the cot and the ground sheet, and put your sleeping bag on top, and that's how you sleep. So it's wonderful. And then that's the evening. The sun's going down. Here's the next morning. Sun's coming up. There's the duffel packs in front. We pack up all our gear. 6 a.m., everybody gets up and have breakfast and get back on the river. The sun's coming up. Just beautiful the way it illuminates the rocks and the vegetation there in the canyon. The sun's spilling over the rim of the canyon. It's breakfast time. Just pick a spot where the scenery's nice and have a feast. It's just great. There's no tables. Just pick a spot anywhere. Beautiful place there. And then it's time to get back on the river. Now, keep your eye. Here we are. We're about to get into these rapids. Keep your eye on that blue hat that the lady is wearing there on the right-hand side of the screen as we get into the rapids. That's fun. That is fun. Yeah. Now we're getting into an interesting area of the canyon. This is below the horizontal layers, the sedimentary rock, and we're getting into some really interesting rock here. This is the Zoroaster granite and the Vishnu schist. Granite, you know what that is, and a schist, for those of you who don't know, that's a metamorphosed rock. It's a rock that used to be something else that through hydrothermal processes and pressure has been turned into something else. And it looks like this. The Zoroaster granite is in pink, and the Vishnu schist is a very dense black, very, very dark-colored, dense, heavy, shiny rock. And there's some of the granite going up through that area. Through the Vishnu there. And you'll recognize a number of these names from Hindu. One of the early geologists was of that particular religion. He named the strata layers that way. Now, how do we understand these from a biblical perspective? These lower layers here, Zoroaster granite, Vishnu schist, and so on, pre-flood and creation week, those rocks were probably created by God supernaturally on day 3 of creation when God created land. And then you have those tilted strata there. And one of the creationist explanations is those were laid down in the 1600 plus years before the flood. As you have erosion from the land, you deposit it on the bottom of the ocean and so on. And then you have the layers, the horizontal layers in the canyon leading up to the rim. They were probably deposited early flood. And then above that, remember there was layers above the rim of the canyon, preserved partially by Red Butte. Those were late flood. And much of that has been eroded. So that's a good biblical way of understanding, just in a general sense, the strata in the canyon. There's many rafting groups that go down the canyon. Here's another rafting group there. Here's what it looks like. This isn't the big rapids, but here's the other raft going through the rapids. We kind of pulled over, and so we could take photographs of them going down these rapids. And there's some of the rock we're looking at, and way up top there, at the top of the picture, that's the Tapete sandstone. That's the lowest of the horizontal layers in the canyon. Now we're way beneath that. And here's some more river photography. Keep your eye on the lady there that has the green poncho there on the left-hand side. That's fun. I mean, it's just great. There's that Vishnu schist again, very black, very dense, very heavy if you get pieces of that. Now, at this point, we're going to hike out of the canyon. We've gone through all of the layers of the rock, and at this point, ICR, we hike out of the canyon. We're at Phantom Ranch. There's a campground and a restaurant at 89 miles. This is, you count river miles. From Lee's Ferry to the 89-mile or 90-mile mark, you have Phantom Ranch. And there's a trail that goes down there, and you can take the trail and hike out of the canyon. That's what we're going to do. There's Phantom Ranch. There's the restaurant. You can go into the restaurant. You can order. There's a bit of a menu there. It's quite expensive because everything, all the supplies, all the food and everything for the restaurant comes down by mule train. You can send mail out by mail bag. Here's a mail bag that's going to go out by mule. And there's a little stamp down there that looks like this: mailed by mule at the bottom of Grand Canyon, Phantom Ranch. And so I sent my mom a postcard and put that stamp on it, mailed by mule from the bottom of Grand Canyon. And so we stopped here to unload most of our gear. Our gear was going to be taken out the next morning by mule, and we were only going to take with us as we hike out just some basic food, some water, notebook if we wanted to, camera, that kind of thing, so we travel light as we hike out of the canyon. And there's our duffel bags on that bench there. And then we have one more night in the canyon. Here's one of the rafts heading back up to our campsite. And there's a bridge. That bridge, if you're hiking in the canyon, you can use that to get from one side of the river to the other. There's great fishing. Some people brought fishing gear, and there's fishing this final night of the canyon here. There's our rafts parked for the evening. And as the sun goes down over the rim, there's our final campsite. Here's how I slept. Again, ground sheet, cot, sleeping bag. We had inch-thick pork chops. This is day 5 in the canyon in a desert environment, and they pull out fresh meat. We're the float and bloat group. You can see that, right? Amazing. These wonderful refrigerators that preserved all this wonderful food. We made our sandwiches that evening for the hike out the next day. Have a look at this. Look, these are tomatoes. There's a couple different types of mustard. There's some mayonnaise or salad dressing back here. We made these monster sandwiches with fresh lettuce and onions and all kinds of things after being for 5 days in a desert environment. here we are the next morning. This is quite early the next morning. We wanted to get on the trail and start getting some altitude so that as the heat of the day sets in, we get up to the higher areas where it's cooler. You get higher, you get cooler, and so on. And so there's me. That's what I looked like in 1996. I've got my water there around my neck on the front there, my camera bag, my hat on to keep from getting too much heat and so on. And then we start hiking out of the canyon. The sun is coming up, starting to get warm, so we want to get some altitude. Now here's a picture with a wide-angle lens. This is looking both up and down. It's a little deceiving, but this is the rim of the canyon. This is obviously looking up, and this is the trail on which I've walked. So this is looking down. The level, if you have a horizon, it's right in here somewhere. All of this is looking up, and from here down, we're looking down. It's a little deceiving, but I've got a long way to go yet to hike out of the canyon. There's another shot looking back at some of the trail there. Here comes the mule train. Some tourists coming down, going down to Phantom Ranch, and they'll spend the night down there, and then they'll come back up the next day on the mule train. And if you think walking down is you'd rather not walk down because the trail drops off, in some cases hundreds and hundreds of feet. And people think, well, I'll just take the mule. But the mules walk right on the edge of the trail, So if you're scared of falling or things like that, you probably want to walk rather than take the mules. There we are looking down. You can see the mule train just making its way down there as it just passed me. And we continue hiking out of the canyon. Here we come across another one of these perspective, these scale moments. How big do you think that wall is there? That wall of rock, the huge wall of rock you see there on the left. I'm going to tell you where people are. You're probably looking for the people already, right? There's people there. That's somebody's T-shirt. Beside him, there's another person a little bit to the right. You can see little dots there. Those are people. If you blow up the picture, you can see people there. But it's huge. Huge, huge place. So this is the Coconino Sandstone that we're seeing at this point. So we're getting quite near the rim of the canyon. We're nearly finished our tour here. The Coconino Sandstone is incredibly cross-bedded. See these cross beds? The layers are laid down horizontally, but within them they have these lines, these cross beds. Now, above and below, the layers above and below, geologists believe they were laid down by water. They're laid down by water. But the Coconino Sandstone, since it's a sandstone, the conventional interpretation is it was laid down as a desert dune. Not in water, but in air. Well, that doesn't fit so well with the biblical history of a global flood, does it? How can you have a desert in the middle of the flood? So, but there's some telltale signs that indicate that this was not laid down in air. The angle of the crossbeds. If there's a sand dune or an underwater sand wave that forms, they form at different angles. What does the angle conform with? An underwater sand dune, not an in-air sand dune. And the pitting, if you look under a microscope, the pitting along on the various grains, they'll be pitted differently if they were tumbled along in air by wind or by water. And again, you look under a microscope, there's evidence that this was laid down underwater, not air. When you look at the evidence, look at the data closely. Sand grains accumulate on the inclined beds on the downcurrent side of the underwater sand wave, just like that. As water flows along, you get these different cross beds forming layer upon layer. And then we're traveling out of the canyon here, and we finally get out, and the Bright Angel Trail, here's where we've come from. The Bright Angel Trail descends 4,500 feet in 7.8 miles to the Colorado River. There it joins the River Trail, which leads an additional 1.8 miles to Phantom Ranch. The Bright Angel Trail is Grand Canyon's most heavily used trail. So we ascended quite a distance after traveling for about 9 miles, and it's quite a hike. When you get to the top, it's 9,000 feet above sea level, so you're really trying to get that oxygen, and the very end of the trail is very, very steep. And so it's a wonderful, wonderful trip. Grand Canyon is an amazing place. And even though it's such an icon for millions of years in evolution, I've got to say this again, it's a great time to be a Christian. We can go to the canyon, and I've in these 45 minutes given you a whirlwind tour of some of the many evidences that are out there that don't fit with millions of years. And we could go into much more detail, but we all want to get to bed. The conventional explanation for the canyon's formation has convinced many that the Bible's history in Genesis can't be trusted. This is an icon of evolution. If the Bible can't even get basic historical events like a global flood right, then how could it be right about anything? Either there was or there was not a global flood. If there was, a global flood is going to figure into the explanation for the formation of the canyon. And we've looked at that in these last few minutes. I've said this in the first presentation. It's impossible to have a solid, robust faith in something that your mind is telling you isn't true. And we have all kinds of kids growing up in churches, and they'll go off to university, and they'll hear all kinds of apparent evidence that the Bible's not true. In geology, and in biology, and in genetics, and anthropology, and radioisotope dating, and where did Cain get his wife, and dinosaurs, and all these different things crowd into their thinking. If you go to Grand Canyon, the park rangers are going to tell you that the river cut the canyon. They're going to tell you it took millions of years. If you look at the interpretive plaques there, well, it took millions of years. That's how the canyon formed. All of the signs there will tell you about the millions of years that it took to form the canyon. In the bookstores, there's books that tell you about the millions of years. Now, there is a book in the bookshops there in Grand Canyon that's a little bit different. It's this one here, Grand Canyon, A Different View by Tom Vail. Tom Vail leads rafting tours through the canyon. Now, this book is a creationist book. We have copies back here in our bookstore. And it doesn't talk about the millions of years, but talks about the formation of the canyon in a biblical time frame. And I'd recommend that book. That's kind of a coffee table book. That's something you'd have beside your couch for visitors to kind of flip through and that kind of thing. Lots of beautiful photography and some commentary there as well. If you're going to Grand Canyon, or you have a love of the canyon, or you're thinking about going to the canyon, I would recommend this almost as a must-have. This is kind of the creationist view of the canyon. And I read through this quite in depth before going on the Grand Canyon tour. And it's not just the canyon. It gives you a good introduction to creationist geology, period. In the back, there's a glossary that all kinds of geologic terms. You can understand very easily from this book some basic geologic terms. If you're not a geologist, this book really helped me to understand some geological terms so I can understand what geologists are writing about in the Journal of Creation, for example. Dr. Steve Austin has done a lot of work around Mount St. Helens as well. That's another DVD. And this is something that you could give to a non-believer, somebody who would never come into a church. It's a video about a mountain blowing itself up, right? But some of the things that Mount St. Helens did help us to understand what may have happened on a larger scale in Noah's flood. And it's really eye-opening to somebody who's convinced that geology proves millions of years. This one here, Noah's Ark, a feasibility study. This is every possible argument that the skeptics have thrown at Noah and the flood is answered in this book. It's a tremendous book, very, very detailed. This one here, Gary mentioned this just a few minutes ago, Annals of the World by James Ussher. It's a chronology of the world, beginning from creation, and it includes a lot of secular history as well. The Journal of Creation, again, in the next issue of the journal is going to be that paper. That's going to give us, perhaps a different understanding of the canyon, another creationist model to understand the canyon. And of course, the website, go to creation.com, type in Grand Canyon, you get a lot of different articles, both technical, both in-depth, and some articles that many articles that non-geologists can understand. The Grand Canyon is a wonderland of geology. It's a wonderland for the photographer. If you're thinking of going, I would highly recommend ICR's tours. I went with ICR. Those are the scientists that did the original research. The thing is, I think they're either no longer doing tours or something like that. I'm unable to get information on that, but there's other people that do tours as well. If you can find a creationist group, I'd recommend you go with them. But get some answers to these questions. The Grand Canyon is a wonderful way that we can look at something that the evolutionists think is theirs, and through simple looking at the rocks and interpreting things biblically, it's actually support for Christianity. It's support that the Bible is true. And that is good news. Thanks very much.